Hi, this is Michael, and today we're gonna talk about Puerto Rico during the Cold War. This is a part of the many 20 plus YouTube channels from educational, scientific, and mostly history channels, YouTubers, that talk about Cold Project MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. The main topic is about the Cold War. But in this video, we're going to talk about the Aire Borinquen, also known as Puerto Rico for most people, and what America did during the Cold War in Puerto Rico. For people don't know it, that the Cold War, like many wars, was considered a global war. Most people think the global war was just World War One and World War Two, or if you're a nerd, it's the 7 Year War, which was called World War Zero. But in reality, there were multiple wars, multiple global wars. Right now, we are currently in a global war called the War on Terror, which basically both the United States and China recently you see Islamophobia and racism of certain ethnic groups. For the United States, will be basically anybody who is Arabic, even though not every Muslim is Arabic. But like I said, racism. In the United States are the Uyghur and Yunhu people. But this is not the case. This is focused about the previous global war we call the Cold War, which many people discuss, like cynical historian who made a video about the origins, how it started, which it all started as far back as the U.S. intervention of the Russian Civil War, which was based on confusion for the most part. But regardless, that confusion inevitably started the Cold War. But still, what Puerto Rico did during the Cold War? Well, it is a complicated history and a topic that most people don't talk about. And you judge it by the video when going to talk about this is going to be a little later, but we have to go through a little context. Since the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, which was in reality not a Bolshevik Soviet style, but actually an anarchist approach of bottom up, where the Bolsheviks actually didn't practice what they preached and had to do the anarchist tactic in order to keep up with everybody else. Once there were opportunities, they took that opportunity to be in power. Instead of becoming a socialist or communist society, instead they became a capitalist society. So the war between the capitalists, Christian, Judeo-Christian nation versus the atheistic communist was actually false propaganda. It was basically two capitalist societies fighting each other with their own version of capitalism. And even then, the Soviet won because every major corporation like Amazon, Walmart, and even the Pentagon used the Leninist approach of a centrally planned state economy. But regardless, what Puerto Rico did during this time, after the Russian Revolution, many of the pro-independence movement in Puerto Rico, which were fighting for their independence for so long, before the 1950s, at the time there were multiple revolutions for the independence. The first one was in 1511, which was the first revolution in Latin American history. Then there was the 1868 revolution called the Cry of Lares. And then there's the 1835 revolution, but that never put in practice. They were caught before they could do anything about it. Then there was the 1898 attempted Cuba Yauco, which again they didn't do anything much, but that's where the Puerto Rico flag that we have today originated. And like I said, there was a lot of attempts, and and even then, like these multiple attempts they tried to do, that eventually, when the United States, made laws that it was illegal to teach Spanish in school. It was illegal to own a Puerto Rican flag. It was illegal to sing the Puerto Rican national anthem. And basically, they're trying to Americanize that because they perceive a very racialized view of Puerto Ricans. They only see Puerto Ricans as the people of color and not white people, even though many white people were Puerto Ricans. Because, like I said, Latinos or Latin Americans is not a racial or ethnic group. But instead, Latino or Latin America was a geographical term. It had nothing to do with race or ethnicity, it was geographic. But regardless, people still have a very racialized, and basically that is not white in general. So there was a lot of discrimination among the Puerto Rican people and discrimination against the independence movement. Like I said, we have multiple revolutions throughout this time. And this point, before the 1950s, we have five revolutions. And out of the five, three at this point was actually put in practice to do it. So what gives? Well, in around this time, when America trying to Americanize it, put it illegal to our identity, But it was also around this time when, even though it was first implemented by the Spanish rule, but they still put it in practice up to the 70s, that it was illegal to publish any literature that promotes independence. So many of the pro-independence Puerto Ricans, especially the socialists, communists, and anarchists, because they were the dominant political philosophy that promoted Puerto Rican independence, that they could allow to publish literature without being persecuted or arrested. When people talk about the quote interpro, the persecution of Black Power movement like the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, or the Chicanos like the Brown Berets, or the Amerindian movement, people forget that the quote interpro originated in Puerto Rico, which is called Law 53 or the Gag Law, which technically speaking is still put in practice to this day. But the problem was that throughout this time, from the 1910s and 1920s, the anarchist movement in Puerto Rico was going to slow down because, like I said, at the time, the majority of the population before the 1920s was illiterate. So the very few people who were literate were arrested or persecuted. And Luisa Capetillo, who was the face of the anarchist movement in Puerto Rico, passed away in her early 40s by tuberculosis. So when she died, basically the anarchist movement virtually died with her. Although there were cases of clandestine underground anarchist movements, they're trying to publish material, but none of them survived, sadly. It wasn't until the 2010s they basically came back to the mainstream politics of Puerto Rico. At this point, when the Russian Revolution happened for the 1920s and 30s, many of the Marxist groups they came in to start their own movements, like the Communist Party of Puerto Rico, for example, and the Socialist Party of Puerto Rico. But the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, founded in 1922, became the leading voice of the movement. Even though the main focus was left-wing nationalism and patriotism for Puerto Rico independence, many of the members were communists and socialists. And in this point, America, this is shortly after the first Red Scare, or technically speaking, the second, because the Second Great Awakening was the original Red Scare. They're trying to do all their best to suppress the Nationalist Party at all costs by horrific attempts of torture, imprisonment, abuse, intimidation, surveillance, spying, etc. That eventually led to the Massacre of Rio Piedra, which was a massacre that happened by the United States government to suppress the nationalist movement in Puerto Rico. And a few years later, that the Ponce Massacre happened, when they massacred roughly around 20 people. One of them was a 7-year-old girl who was shot in the back, and 100, almost 200 people were injured. This movement hurt the Nationalist Party because throughout history, the Puerto Rican political movements of radicalism was heavily pacifist and nonviolent by nature. So when they witnessed these horrible massacres, that they move away out of fear of being killed by the U.S. government, especially the National Guard. Throughout all these events, when Jesus Piñero, who actually wanted to give Puerto Rico independence by the federal government in 1848, but Luis Muñoz Marin, who was originally a pro-independence politician but later became a conservative Republican promoting Puerto Rican colonialism and imperialism, that the only chance Puerto Rico had that the United States government was going to actually give the independence, he blocked that to ever come to Puerto Rico to sign this. So the only hope they actually have it by American permission was forever lost, which eventually led to militarism of the movement. That the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico eventually created a paramilitary group separatist organization called the Cadet of the Republic, which were trained to start a revolution in Puerto Rico. And in this time, many groups, like the Communist Party of Puerto Rico, helped them to train and send funds, and also the Freemasons as well were promoting the Puerto Rican independence movement. They also helped them, and some members of the Freemasonry joined the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico for the cause. And this inevitably started the 1950 revolution. Throughout this time, America didn't like what they were seeing. So, despite the massacres they committed against the Puerto Rican people, human experimentation as well, like early contraception and ethnic cleansing, before Nazi Germany did this to the Jews, the Americans already did it to Puerto Rico a few years earlier by Dr. Cornelius Rose, because of eugenics, and because they viewed the Puerto Rican people as the lowest disgusting race the world has ever seen, and by the words of the man himself, worse than the Italians. So for the most part, the struggle for Puerto Rican people was a struggle for survival for the longest time. But American government didn't like they were seeing, so they sent the U.S. Air Force or the Air National Guard in this case and bombed Puerto Rico in Utuado and Honduras. It's the one that was 500 tons of DNT and the other 1,500 tons of DNT. It shows you that the federal government was no friend to democracy, and it will go out of this way to keep their colonial position in there by straight up bombing their own citizens. Because at this point, Puerto Ricans was considered U.S. citizens in 1917 as an excuse to drive more soldiers to World War One. And because of this, despite being bombed to the ground by their own civilian, there was called the Tuago Massacre, which again, the U.S. National Guard came in, took the nationalist parties who were fighting, but they surrendered peacefully. They lowered down their cars and they peacefully raised their hand. They were like, "Okay, we surrender. We go into jail. I understand, right? No more bloodshed." Despite that, peacefully giving up, laying down their guard, they massacred them on the spot. And one of them was bleeding to them, asking for water. But one of the soldiers, instead of giving him water because he was bleeding to death, he stabbed him with a bayonet and insulting the party leaders and members and using racial slurs and stuff like that. So the National Guard, the police, or the Colonial Insular Police that they used to call back then, and the CIA, FBI, that they were basically persecuting the entire Puerto Rican population, arresting thousands of civilians, including children that had nothing to do with the movement, going to prison. Many people were tortured, and human experimentation have occurred. Mysterious cases of giving them mysterious pills, and many of them die of heart attacks, or burying them alive with bed bugs, and just beating them to the ground with their sticks and stuff. It was a horrific case of torture and concentration camps in general in Puerto Rico. And one of the worst examples when the revolution ended in failure after the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico trying to assassinate President Truman around like the day or 2 days after the revolution started, that accused President Truman accused Puerto Rico and the revolution as a bunch of crazy fascist communists. You heard me right. I didn't make that mistake. I wasn't being, sarcastic. He called them both communists and fascists at the same time to describe these people. These people who were not white and primarily speak Spanish with a mix of Taino language. So it shows you the aggressive nature of it. And despite the horrible atrocity the United States has committed to Puerto Rico during the revolution, like the bombing of Jayuya and Utuado, and the Utuado massacres, and the multiple human experimentation among the people who were in prison after the revolution, many people were in prison for decades at their time, and their leader, Abisu, their leader, who was tortured and burned alive with radiation. And people accused of being crazy discovered, when a Cuban doctor came and examined his body, it's been confirmed that he had high doses of radiation all over his body and he was being burned alive. And there's an urban legend that the doctor who was burning him alive with radiation was the infamous Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, the angel of death. Although that's never been confirmed, that's just an urban legend with no evidence to back it up. So what do we learn throughout this short history? It shows you that America, despite calling itself the face of democracy, is an imperialist colonialist powerhouse that they wanted to keep their colonies at all costs, even at the expense of the lives of the people who wanted to be free. And after the revolution ended 2 years later, their first quote unquote election happened. Well, unlike the Philippines, where they gave them the option to be independent or stay as a colony or whatever, everybody bought independence, so they got independence, the Philippines. But in Puerto Rico's case, they only had two choices: colony or feudalism, because that was the Puerto Rico was at the time, a military government based on feudalism, where only one man, the owner of Domino Sugar, owned 40% of the island. So not even the option of independence was even in the election. They didn't give them a choice. They were forced to become either colonies, regardless, either feudalism or some better version of colonialism, which is still former slavery. And even then, after the 50s, when 1954, when the Nationalist Party again attacked the U.S. Capitol for Puerto Rican independence, The US government again responds attacking their leaders and other people who were innocent who had nothing to do with the attacks and torturing them and putting them in prison and trying to massacre them, but never actually achieve it. And throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were cases of death squads by the CIA, FBI using anti-Castro Cubans, and did acts of terrorism throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Throughout this time, there was a 30-year low-scale war between Puerto Rico and the United States, similar to the Irish Trouble between the RRA and the British government in North Island. And that was the case in Puerto Rico with the groups like the Boricua Popular Party or the AALN, which was mostly in the United States, doing and other similar groups who did over 300 military operations against the federal government. And in most cases, they won many of the conflicts between American military and the separatist groups for Puerto Rican independence. In fact, it was so successful, the clandestine group, they managed to kick out the Navy in Puerto Rico, and they did the largest attack against the U.S. Air Force in history. So far, the Puerto Rico Popular Army is the only group that did more damage to the Air Force than any other group in history. And even then, after all that, their leader, Filiberto, was murdered by the FBI in cold blood in 2005, making the end of the war. But even then, it shows you the history of colonialism and imperialism in Puerto Rico by the United States. They will do out of their way to do horrific acts of violence using straight up fascism in order to justify their reign, while the people who at this point had gone 6 revolutions, a 30-year low-scale war, trying to kill the president, attack the capital, etc., to be free. And so far, they are still fighting to be free by using more reformist electoralist politics. So yeah, thank you everybody who watched the video. There will be more videos. If you're interested about the Cold War in general, go to the YouTube playlist called Project Mad to get a more academic and more better video audio videos about the subject of the Cold War.